On a quiet morning at Caracas International Airport, air traffic controllers picked up a signal they were not expecting. A slow, outdated Douglas DC-4 was approaching the runway, yet its call sign did not appear on any flight schedule. When the pilot's voice came through the radio, it sounded confused, almost shaken. He asked a question no modern controller expects to hear. "Where are we, and what year is it?" The answer came back calmly. "It is 1992. The cockpit fell silent. Moments later, ground crews noticed the markings on the aircraft's fuselage. Pan Am Flight 914. The legend claims this flight departed New York in 1955 and vanished without a distress call, without wreckage, and without explanation. Now it had returned 37 years later, carrying passengers who had not aged a single day. If a commercial airliner crossed decades and landed intact, it would be one of the most serious events in aviation history. So why does no official record seem to remember it? The story of Pan Am Flight 914 is usually told with precise details, which is part of what makes it feel believable. According to the legend, the flight departed on July 2, 1955, traveling from New York to Miami. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-4, a propeller-driven airliner commonly used during that era. On board were around 60 passengers, along with a full flight crew, all expecting a routine trip down the East Coast. Somewhere between departure and arrival, the story claims the aircraft vanished, not after sending a distress call, not during severe weather. It simply disappeared from radar while cruising through clear skies. No debris was ever found. No emergency signals were recorded. No wreckage washed ashore. For decades, the flight was said to exist only as an unanswered question, frozen in time. But when this account is placed beside verified aviation records, the picture changes dramatically. Official archives from Pan American World Airways, one of the most documented airlines of the 20th century, contain no record of a missing Flight 914 in 1955. Fleet logs, route schedules, and internal reports from that period show no unexplained loss matching this description. The same absence appears in the files of the Federal Aviation Administration. There are no accident reports, no missing aircraft investigations, and no references to 61 people vanishing on the New York to Miami route during that time. Commercial aviation in the 1950s was already tightly tracked, and disappearances of this scale triggered immediate, long-term investigations. None exist for Flight 914. This is where the story begins to feel unstable. The idea of an airliner vanishing without a trace sounds mysterious, but in reality, such events leave behind paperwork, headlines, and years of official scrutiny. Even in an era with less advanced technology, aircraft losses were never simply forgotten. Yet the legend insists otherwise. It presents a flight that somehow slipped past every system, every authority, and every historical record, only to return decades later as if time itself had paused on board. That contradiction is the heart of the mystery. If no airline logs remember this flight and no aviation agency ever searched for it, then the question shifts. Not where did the plane go, but something far more unsettling. If Pan Am Flight 914 never existed in the first place, how did its story spread so widely, and why has it survived for so long? One detail appears in almost every version of the Pan Am Flight 914 legend. The plane did not crash, it did not turn back, it did not call for help. According to the story, it simply vanished from radar in midair. That phrase alone carries a powerful weight, because radar feels precise, scientific, and absolute. If something disappears from radar, it sounds as if it has slipped out of reality itself. But radar in 1955 was nothing like the systems people imagine today. Civilian air traffic radar at the time had limited range, uneven coverage, and frequent blind spots, especially at lower altitudes and over coastal areas. Aircraft could temporarily fade from a controller's screen for many reasons, including terrain, distance, or technical interference. What did not happen was a large commercial airliner vanishing forever without a trace. When radar contact was lost unexpectedly, procedure took over. Controllers documented the incident, airlines were alerted, search and rescue operations were launched. Even if the cause remained unclear, the paper trail always remained. Aviation history is filled with accidents that were tragic, confusing, and incomplete, but none were ignored. A missing aircraft meant reports, investigations, and years of follow-up. This is where the Flight 914 story begins to strain under scrutiny. There is no official investigation tied to a radar disappearance on the New York to Miami route in 1955. No emergency bulletins, no search areas, no accident summaries. The absence is total. For an airline as closely monitored as Pan American, such a silence would be impossible. The legend sounds technical enough to feel credible, yet it does not match how aviation actually worked, even during its early jet age. Radar loss was not a mystery trigger. It was the beginning of documentation, not the end of it. If a DC-4 carrying dozens of passengers truly vanished, the event would exist somewhere in the historical record. Instead, the story asks the audience to accept something else. It asks us to believe that a commercial flight slipped past every safeguard, every authority, and every investigative process of its time. That contradiction is subtle, but it is critical. The more closely the radar claim is examined, the less stable it becomes. And if the disappearance itself does not hold up, attention naturally shifts forward in time, because the legend does not end in 1955. It insists the plane returned. Not as wreckage, not as a recovered mystery, but as a fully intact aircraft touching down in Caracas decades later. That raises a new question. If the radar story already fails, what happens when we examine the landing that followed? At first glance, Caracas feels like the perfect setting for the legend's return. During the 1950s and 1960s, airports in Venezuela regularly handled propeller aircraft like the Douglas DC-4. Pan American routes passed through the region, and older airframes were still flying well into later decades. That historical detail gives the story a sense of realism. A DC-4 appearing over Venezuela does not immediately sound impossible. But realism begins to collapse when the timeline moves forward to 1992. By that year, air traffic control procedures were standardized, documented, and tightly regulated. Any aircraft entering Venezuelan airspace without clearance would have triggered immediate alerts. A foreign commercial plane landing without authorization would not have been treated as a curiosity. It would have been treated as a security event. Yet no such event exists in the records of Caracas or its main international airport. There are no air traffic logs describing an unidentified DC-4 appearing unexpectedly. There are no emergency reports, no runway closures, and no military responses tied to such a landing. A surprise arrival of this scale would have involved airport authorities, immigration officials, airline representatives, and national aviation regulators. None of those institutions have any documentation connected to Flight 914. The story often claims that the aircraft landed, was briefly questioned, and then departed again. That scenario raises even more problems. An unscheduled international flight does not simply refuel and leave. Aircraft are inspected, crews are detained, passengers are processed, paperwork follows every movement. There would be manifests, customs forms, medical evaluations, and official statements. In this case, there are none. One specific detail is repeated to anchor the legend. An air traffic controller named Juan de la Corte is said to have communicated with the pilot. However, no individual by that name appears in official personnel lists or historical records connected to Caracas air traffic control. There are no interviews, no reports, and no contemporary mentions that place this person at the center of such an extraordinary event. This is the moment when a critical support beam collapses. The disappearance might be explained away with mystery. The return cannot. Landings leave evidence. Airports are designed to record, not forget. The absence of documentation is not a small oversight. It is a complete void where hundreds of official actions should exist. Once that realization sets in, the legend begins to unravel. Each missing record forces the story to rely more heavily on repetition rather than proof. And with that reliance come inconsistencies. Dates shift, names change, locations blur. What once sounded like a hidden incident now resembles something else entirely. If the landing never happened, then the mystery does not belong to aviation history. It belongs to the story itself. And that raises the next question. If this was not a forgotten event, where did it actually come from and who first told it? As the story of Pan Am Flight 914 is retold across articles, videos, and forums, its weakest points begin to surface in the details. These are not minor gaps or missing footnotes. They are contradictions that grow larger the closer the story is examined. Start with the flight itself. The claimed travel time between New York and Miami does not consistently match the performance of a Douglas DC-4. In some versions, the aircraft appears to arrive too early. In others, it lingers far longer than fuel capacity would reasonably allow. The numbers shift depending on who is telling the story, which immediately raises concern. Real flight records are rigid. Legends are flexible. The pilot's radio transmissions are another red flag. The dialogue often quoted sounds dramatic, but it does not resemble standardized aviation communication. Professional pilots follow strict phrasing, especially when confused or in distress. Casual questions about the date and location, delivered in the way the legend describes, would be highly unusual. They read more like lines written for effect than words spoken over an international control frequency. Dates and scheduling present similar problems. Some tellings place the disappearance in early July. Others quietly move it to a different day or even a different year. The same thing happens with the supposed return. Sometimes it is 1992. In other versions, the date drifts. These changes may seem small, but in aviation, dates are fixed points. When they slide, credibility slides with them. One of the most implausible elements appears near the end of the story. The aircraft is said to have taken off again without proper clearance and vanished a second time. In any modern air traffic system, that sequence is effectively impossible. Unauthorized departures trigger alarms, security responses, and immediate documentation. No commercial aircraft simply rolls onto a runway and disappears unnoticed, especially after already drawing attention. Perhaps the clearest warning sign is how unstable the story becomes over time. Different versions introduce different airports. New characters appear while others vanish. Names change. Locations shift. These variations are not corrections based on new evidence. They are improvisations added to keep the story alive. That pattern is not how real events behave. Verified incidents grow more precise as information accumulates. Urban legends move in the opposite direction. They adapt to the audience. They trade accuracy for impact. Each retelling becomes less about what happened and more about what sounds compelling. By this point, the mystery no longer rests on a missing airplane. It rests on the story itself. When the core facts refuse to stay still, the question is no longer whether something extraordinary occurred. It becomes something else entirely. Why does this story keep changing, and what kind of source allows that to happen in the first place? The Trail of Pan Am. Flight 914 does not lead to an aviation archive, a government database, or a forgotten investigation file. It leads somewhere else entirely. The first known appearance of this story surfaced in 1985, not in a flight log or an airline report, but in the pages of Weekly World News. At the time, Weekly World News was widely circulated across the United States, stacked near supermarket checkout lines and gas station counters. Its reputation was unmistakable. The paper specialized in sensational headlines and fictional stories, often blending familiar real-world elements with outrageous claims. Aliens living among humans, supernatural creatures, and secret government experiments were recurring themes. Accuracy was never the goal. Attention was. Flight 914 fit perfectly into that formula. The article presented a complete narrative with specific dates, locations, and dialogue, giving readers the illusion of a documented event. Yet it provided no sources. There were no names that could be verified, no institutions quoted, and no witnesses who could be independently identified. The story stood entirely on its own authority, asking readers to accept it as fact without offering a way to check it. That absence is important. Real investigative journalism invites scrutiny. It points outward toward evidence that can be examined. This story did the opposite. It closed in on itself. Every detail pointed back to the article, not beyond it. The more extraordinary the claim, the thinner the support became. What made the story powerful was not proof, but presentation. It borrowed the language of aviation, used a real airline, referenced a real aircraft model, and placed the event in a plausible location. These familiar anchors created a sense of realism that masked the lack of verification. Readers recognized Pan Am. They recognized Caracas. They recognized the idea of a commercial flight route. That familiarity lowered skepticism. Once published, the story began to move. It was retold, summarized, and reshaped. Over time, it escaped its original context. Later versions often dropped the tabloid reference entirely, presenting the account as an unsolved mystery rather than a fictional report. As it traveled, it picked up new details and lost old ones, adapting to new audiences and new media. This is how modern legends are born. They do not require secrecy or conspiracy. They only need repetition. When a story is engaging enough, it spreads faster than corrections ever could. The origin becomes blurred, and the fiction slowly hardens into something that feels historical. By the time Flight 914 reached online forums and video platforms decades later, its tabloid roots were rarely mentioned. What remained was the narrative itself, stripped of context and presented as a question rather than a claim. And once that transformation is complete, the story no longer needs evidence to survive. It only needs belief. By this stage, the factual situation is clear. There is no physical evidence supporting the story of Pan Am Flight 914. No aircraft has ever been recovered. No passengers have stepped forward. No medical records document people who vanished in the 1950s and reappeared decades later unchanged. There are no photographs, no verified documents, and no independent witnesses who can be traced back to a real event. From an evidentiary standpoint, the case is empty. Because of that, aviation researchers and historians consistently place Flight 914 in the same category as other time travel legends, often mentioned alongside stories connected to the Bermuda Triangle. These are not unsolved cases in the legal or scientific sense. They are narratives that persist despite the absence of proof. The question then is not whether the story is real, but why it remains so compelling. Part of the answer lies in when the story first appeared. The mid-20th century, especially the Cold War era, was a period of rapid technological change. Commercial aviation transformed how people understood distance and time. Flights that once took days now took hours. Jets crossed oceans. Satellites entered orbit. For many, the pace of change felt unsettling as much as it felt exciting. At the same time, fear shaped public imagination. Nuclear weapons, experimental aircraft, and classified research projects created the sense that governments and scientists were unlocking forces ordinary people could not fully grasp. When knowledge advances faster than understanding, mystery fills the gap. Stories like Flight 914 thrive in that space. The legend offers a specific kind of intrigue. It suggests that time itself might be unstable, that technology could slip beyond human control, and that ordinary people could be caught in forces far larger than themselves. Importantly, it does so without villains or disasters. The passengers are not harmed. The plane is not destroyed. Instead, everything is preserved, as if sealed inside a moment that refused to move forward. That detail matters. Many myths endure because they are frightening. Flight 914 endures because it is unsettling in a quieter way. It hints that reality might bend without warning, and that the systems built to keep the world orderly might not be absolute. It turns progress into uncertainty rather than safety. The story also rewards belief without demanding responsibility. There is no need to solve anything. No one is blamed. No conclusion is required. Listeners can simply wonder, share the story, and move on, carrying the mystery with them. In that sense, the legend functions more like modern folklore than a historical claim. Flight 914 does not survive because evidence supports it. It survives because it satisfies a psychological need. It transforms anxiety about technology, time, and control into a narrative that feels extraordinary but safe. As long as those fears exist, stories like this will continue to circulate, reshaped for each new generation, even when the facts remain silent. When a story reaches this stage, it no longer behaves like a report of an event. It behaves like a living thing. The legend of Pan Am, Flight 914, became powerful not because it was proven, but because it occupied a very specific space. It was mysterious enough to spark curiosity, detailed enough to sound authentic, and vague enough to avoid being easily disproven. That balance allowed it to detach from its origin and begin a life of its own. Once separated from its tabloid source, the story was free to circulate. Over time, it appeared in books about unexplained phenomena, late-night radio shows, internet forums, and eventually YouTube videos. In these new environments, Flight 914 was often framed as an unresolved case rather than a fictional narrative. The language shifted subtly. What had once been presented as a sensational claim became a question. What really happened to this flight? Why was it erased from history? That framing is crucial. When a story is labeled unsolved, the burden of proof feels reversed. Skepticism is treated as closed-mindedness, while belief is framed as curiosity. Viewers and readers are encouraged to speculate, to connect dots, and to imagine hidden explanations. The absence of evidence becomes part of the mystery instead of a reason to dismiss it. In this process, repetition replaces verification. The same core elements are retold again and again. A vanished plane. A sudden landing decades later. Passengers untouched by time. Each retelling reinforces familiarity, and familiarity creates comfort. Eventually, many people encounter the story multiple times across different platforms without ever seeing its original source. At that point, it feels established, even historical. However, when historians and aviation experts examine Flight 914, their conclusions are consistent. There is no missing aircraft in the records, no unexplained investigation, no anomaly hidden in the archives. From a professional standpoint, the case is closed before it ever opens. It is not an unsolved mystery. It is a piece of modern fiction. This does not mean the story lacks value. It reveals something important about how myths are formed in the modern age. Unlike ancient legends passed down orally, these stories spread through media ecosystems that reward attention. The more dramatic the claim, the more likely it is to be shared. Accuracy becomes secondary to engagement. Flight 914 is often used as an example of this process. It shows how easily a narrative can escape its context and be reshaped into something larger than its source. What begins as entertainment slowly hardens into belief, not because evidence appears, but because correction rarely travels as far as the original claim. In the end, the truth behind Flight 914 is not hidden in classified files or lost archives. It is visible in plain sight. The mystery was never about a plane traveling through time. It was about how stories travel through people, and once a story reaches enough minds, it no longer needs facts to survive. In the end, Pan Am Flight 914 is not a story about time travel or passengers trapped between decades. It is a story about belief and how easily a narrative can feel real when it is told the right way. A real airline, a real aircraft, a familiar route. Once those elements are in place, the line between fact and fiction becomes harder to see. What gives this legend its power is not evidence, but repetition. A sensational claim appears, gets retold, stripped of its original context, and slowly reframed as an unanswered mystery. Over time, the question changes. It is no longer, did this happen? But what if it did? And that shift is where modern myths take hold. In today's digital world, stories like Flight 914 spread faster than ever. Platforms reward curiosity and shock more than verification. The more mysterious a claim sounds, the more likely it is to be shared. Corrections rarely travel as far or feel as exciting. What survives is the version people want to believe. This does not mean belief is foolish. Humans are drawn to stories that challenge certainty and suggest the world is larger, stranger, and less controlled than it appears. Flight 914 offers that feeling. It creates wonder without requiring proof, and mystery without demanding resolution. So the real question is not where the plane went. It is why the story stayed. If a narrative is compelling enough, does it still matter whether it is true? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to MindGap as we continue exploring the thin line between fact, fiction, and the stories we choose to believe.